Hi, everyone. I see we have many attendees streaming in, which is great. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Just one logistical note. If you have questions for our panelists throughout the session, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A feature. That is where we will be pulling questions from at the end of our agenda during the discussion portion. Again, please use the Q&A feature. The chat is available to you, but we will be pulling questions from there. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Jasmine.
Thank you, Ellen. My name is Jasmine McGee, and I'm Director of the Public Protection Section for the North Carolina Department of Justice. We are here today for our fourth and final session in our webinar series on cannabis. To view our prior three sessions, please click on the link that's being put in the chat. You will find lots of detailed information about the intersection of cannabis regulation with public health considerations, taxation policy, farming and cultivation, and we encourage you to watch those. But today, we're going to focus on racial equity issues in cannabis policy. For a little bit of background on this topic before I turn it over to our speakers, the Attorney General serves as the chair of the Task Force for Racial Equity and Criminal Justice, which was signed into existence by Governor Cooper in 2020 via his executive order. I serve as the DOJ staff lead on that task force, and we made several recommendations related to marijuana in our final report, and Ellen is putting those recommendations in the chat. Recommendations 71, 72, and 73. They are to deprioritize marijuana-related arrests and prosecutions. That's for law enforcement and for prosecutors. To decriminalize the possession of up to 1.5 ounces of marijuana. It's a legislative change, and then to convene a task force of stakeholders to study the pros and cons and options for legalization of possession, cultivation, and/or sale of marijuana. And of note, if you look at the text of the recommendation, it talks about the importance of considering racial equity in that legalization model. So we felt quite strongly that we could not conclude this series without addressing the issue of racial equity in this space. Marijuana is the most widely used illegal substance in the United States, and studies demonstrate that Black and white Americans use marijuana at similar rates. Despite that, Black North Carolinians experience significantly different charging and conviction rates for possession of marijuana than white North Carolinians. The Criminal Justice Innovation Lab at the UNC School of Government has provided us with the most up-to-date data available on the racial breakdown of misdemeanor marijuana charges in North Carolina. We want to express our thanks to Professor Jessie Smith and her colleague, Andre Asumkow, for this valuable data. Ellen is dropping a link to it in the chat. On this landing page that you have access to, it shows that criminal charging data for 2019 through 2021 for the 3 misdemeanors in North Carolina associated with marijuana possession and use. You can see that 50.2% of marijuana offenses charged during that time period were brought against Black North Carolinians, while Black North Carolinians represent just 21.5% of the population. And you can use this dashboard to make comparisons across racial groups and even isolate the data to a single county or charge type or year. It's also worth noting that in 2021, there were still 33,000 misdemeanor marijuana offenses charged in North Carolina. So these continuing differences on the impact of marijuana policy is why we believe it is critical to center racial equity in any conversation about racial cannabis policy, from medical cannabis to decriminalization to adult use. So with that context, I want to turn it over to our first speaker, John Hudak, who is the Deputy Director of the Center for Effective Policy Management and Senior Fellow of Governance Studies at the Brookings Institute. He's going to talk about how medical cannabis policy should address racial equity and the impact it can have on future decriminalization and legalization efforts. John?
Jasmine, thank you for the introduction, and thanks to the North Carolina Attorney General's Office for organizing this today. This is a really important topic. Before I begin, I do want to apologize to everyone in advance. I apologize to our colleagues at the AG's office already. My roof is being replaced today, and in the spirit of all of us working from home, or most of us working from home, I apologize in advance for any background noise that might be distracting, but I'll try to talk over it the best that I can. Medical cannabis is frequently not the place in which we have a discussion around racial justice and social equity in this country. Typically, those conversations are reserved for when a state begins to discuss adult use cannabis. But that is no excuse for what is really a failure in policy to address that at the beginning of the process that a state takes towards relaxing its cannabis laws. There have been a few states that have tried to factor social equity issues and racial justice issues into their medical cannabis programs. I think in those states, there tends to be a lot still to be desired from those programs, but it should not dissuade a state like North Carolina to put those considerations into place as they're first thinking about medical cannabis, and then, if passed, implementing a medical cannabis program. There's a lot of opportunities to address past harms in these systems through medical cannabis. And I think any opportunity to move away from prohibition signals a couple of things to a state and to its residents. The first is that that state is no longer thinking of cannabis as something that is inherently bad or inherently criminal or something that should always be punished. And I think it's important for a state to say, listen, if we are going to think of cannabis as a medicine, how else should we think about the types of crimes that we punish people for when it comes to cannabis? Should they be misdemeanors? Should they, in some states, be felonies? How should we rethink this entire system, even if we're not moving all the way forward with adult use legalization, but if we are loosening those restrictions around medical? And I'm going to talk a little bit about the cannabis industry and the opportunities that exist through a regulated market to address issues of social equity and to put into place the types of policies that might be able to address some of those issues that are, like I said before, considered in adult use systems to be addressed in the medical system. But before I do that, I want to talk about equity in a different way. Oftentimes, and my fellow panelist, Shalene Title, is certainly an exception to this, but oftentimes when we think about social equity in the cannabis space, we think about how do we get people from communities that were harmed by the drug war to have ownership opportunities in the cannabis industry. And that is certainly a consideration. It's a consideration that has happened in a lot of states, particularly states that have legalized recently for adult use. But equity is much broader than that. And so we need to think about equity in a medical cannabis system on a variety of dimensions. And a few of those are access, price, and the interaction between patients and the healthcare system. So access is a really big issue. In a lot of states that have medical and or adult use cannabis programs, there is the ability of counties and municipalities to opt out of the system. That is to say, we're not going to allow cannabis to be grown here, processed here, tested here, and most importantly, sold here in this jurisdiction. Typically, urban areas tend to opt into these systems. And so people of color, poor residents who live in urban areas typically have better access to cannabis, but that doesn't solve the whole problem. Rural poor, rural people of color oftentimes end up in situations, particularly in geographically larger states, where it is a significant distance for them to drive to the nearest medical cannabis dispensary. And what we know about individuals from those socioeconomic statuses and those racial and ethnic groups is that long distance transportation is often much more difficult than it is for white residents and for residents of higher means. And so when we think about laying out a system that is equitable, we have to think about the ability of those residents to actually get the medicine that they need, and how those differences in access do have racial, ethnic, and economic inequities built into those systems, or ideally overcome within those systems to make access more available. And just as important as geographic access is economic access. And so systems in which medical cannabis is priced exorbitantly high, it does affect the ability of sick patients, oftentimes who are of limited means, to be able to get that medicine that a healthcare professional has said is important for them and is important for their health and for their health care. The last part I'll talk about in this, as I said, was the ability of individuals to interact with the existing healthcare system to get access to medical cannabis through a recommendation. And often, and we know historically and we know empirically that people of color in this country have a very difficult time accessing quality and affordable healthcare. And people of color, particularly women of color, have a very difficult time with healthcare practitioners believing them and listening to them and being an advocate for them. And those inequities in the healthcare system always transfer over to a medical cannabis system. And so it's incumbent upon a state to think about those challenges that will exist in communities of color and in poorer communities to try to design a system that helps overcome some of those challenges and some of those barriers that individuals will have so that a medical cannabis system is more equitable. Now I'll talk briefly about the industry side, the sort of traditional way in which we think about social equity in the cannabis space. Oftentimes, states do not think about access to the industry for people who hail from communities affected disproportionately by the drug war. As I said, on the medical side, we do this in some states on the adult use side, but not on the medical side. And in fact, in many states, they set up medical cannabis systems that undermine the ability of people from those demographic groups to have access to ownership opportunities within the space. Those barriers include no consideration for race or ethnicity or the impact of community by the drug war in terms of licensing. In some states, they'll have point systems in licensing that will add some points to a license application for people who come from communities affected by the drug war. In addition, there are very high barriers to entry traditionally in medical cannabis systems. It's not always the case. We have some exceptions like Oklahoma and others, but it traditionally is the case. Those high barriers to entry include exorbitant license fees, very high capital requirements before even the first hole is dug or the first brick is laid in a cannabis facility. No options for micro grows, which in adult use states is oftentimes an avenue by which social equity licensing happens. And really no success building environments for industry operators who hail from these types of social equity groups or communities affected by the drug war. And so that sets up an opportunity first that really bars a lot of potential licensee applicants from the system. And then if they are able to enter the system, doesn't create an environment that facilitates success among those licensees, among those business owners. And so thinking about the ways that those barriers can really stifle opportunity and keep people out of the industry and keep patients, as I said before, from being able to access medical cannabis are critical considerations for any state that is both considering an expansion into the medical cannabis space and values equity in that system as a core belief and a core value that needs to be part of that system. In the long term, barring people or setting up barriers to people entering the cannabis space from communities affected deeply by the drug war has profound long-term considerations. In many states, when a state transitions or moves rather from having a medical cannabis system to having an adult use cannabis system, there are definitely first mover advantages. You have these businesses that are up and running and most of them are making money. They understand the industry, they understand the plant, they understand what the regulatory environment within a state is. And those are all extraordinary advantages for any business in an industry that is looking to grow or expand into other areas. The second way in which that first mover advantage manifests is that many states that expand from medical cannabis only into adult use cannabis grandfather in existing medical cannabis companies to begin producing in the adult use cannabis space if they choose to apply for that, and most of them do. And in fact, most of those businesses build out medical cannabis facilities larger than they need to be, with the expectation that when adult use cannabis is legalized, that they will be ready to operate in an effective way. And so when that grandfathering happens, it automatically gives additional opportunities for the existing medical cannabis industry, medical cannabis operators to operate in the adult use cannabis space. And so when that happens, it creates further hurdles if groups significantly affected by the drug war have already been kept out of the medical cannabis space to be able to have a leg up or have an avenue to success in the adult use cannabis space. And so I've hit about my 10 minutes, and so I'm going to wrap up there, and excited to hear the comments from my friend Shalene, and also excited to hear the Q&A from each of you later on.
Thank you, John. You've already teed up our next speaker is Shalene Title. She is the Distinguished Cannabis Policy Practitioner in Residence at Drug Enforcement and Policy Center at the Moritz College of Law at The Ohio State University. And she is going to talk about lessons learned and how other states have addressed racial equity in cannabis policy. Shalene.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, Jasmine. Thanks to John and all the other panelists. I really love the way that you have structured these panels, and having an hour, on each topic is wonderful. So thank you for having me. I'm particularly going to talk about concepts that are in 2 papers that I've written over the past year. And the way these came about is I served as a regulator in Massachusetts. I was appointed by the Attorney General, Governor, and Treasurer there in 2017. Served through 2020. And then when the term was over, I was having so many of these types of meetings and panels, and there's only so much you can say, in a few minutes. So the purpose of the papers was to try and take all of the most important information that I've learned and make it accessible. So definitely take a look if you want to learn more about this. One is on social equity and one is on preventing monopolies in the national marijuana market. So equity is actually a term that I'm trying to stop using because it has become so co-opted and meaningless. That happens with language sometimes. Whereas equity really just means fairness. And I love what John said about how it is much more broad than we usually talk about it in cannabis, and protection of medical patients and access for medical patients is an excellent example of where fairness is important. That's all it means. And it's going to be different what fairness or equity looks like in each state. But from Massachusetts, as the first state to attempt to implement equity into our regulation process, there are a lot of universal concepts that we can share that I hope will be helpful regardless of what you decide equity or fairness looks like in North Carolina specifically. So first, I just want to point out that when we talk about fairness, racial equity is going to be by far the top priority. And that's because every single state in this country has disproportionately harmed people of color, not all people of color, Black and Latino, and sometimes Native people especially. And you heard the stats in the opening here. You'll hear the stats in every state in panels like this. It's really important that when we talk about fairness, that we start with the communities that were targeted by marijuana laws and drug laws all of this time. And that can be through expungements, through criminal justice reform, through using tax revenue to reinvest into those same communities. And then what I worked on primarily, which is economic justice, meaning jobs, ownership and licenses, and access to making money, because we don't want to see the exact same big businesses making all of the money off of this extremely lucrative business. We want it to be fair to the people who were harmed, and then fair in general, a level playing field. I think that is the goal here. So what I want to share that we've learned is a couple of things when it comes to a level playing field. The first is kind of obvious. You identify the groups that have been historically excluded or historically targeted by the drug war, recognizing the difference between those two groups, and states have all different ways that they've defined them. And then you give benefits, and it won't be surprising that you need benefits like technical assistance, access to capital and loans because you can't get a bank loan, and a lot of guidance to go through the process to make up for all of the damage, that communities have gone through as a result of the war on drugs. But then the second piece is leveling the playfield in general by making this a fair opportunity where everyone has a chance. So John talked about how there's very high barriers to entry. That's exactly the key here, is we won't have a level playing field until we reduce those barriers to entry and look at all of the different markets that are in place now and make evidence-based decisions that are not based on fear or stigma, but rather the reality and data that we have in front of us. I also want to say you don't have to use the same models that other states have used. You can think about fairness and equity. And one thing that's brought up a lot is the idea of potentially state-regulated stores. I think we are long overdue for a state to try that model. I think from a public health perspective and an equity perspective, it makes sense to see a state try that. So I hope that is considered strongly. But so we talk about benefits, and then we talk about a level playing field. So a really important part, and this is what I learned in Massachusetts, the biggest lesson that I learned is the huge barrier to a level playing field is special advantages for certain companies. And that usually does end up being medical operators, existing medical marijuana companies that started back before anybody was talking about equity, and that was a priority. And so what a wonderful opportunity that North Carolina has to avoid that whole situation and be equitable from the beginning before you even pass or implement medical marijuana. That could be a real model, I think. So I'm glad you're talking about equity early. I would encourage you to really take that special advantage thing seriously, because I would say this year I've been surprised by how blatant those pushes for special advantages have been and how they've gotten disguised in different places. Most recently in Virginia, we've seen a push for certain companies to get an early head start on sales, essentially an oligopoly. And that was attached to necessary criminal justice reform measures in one bill. And fortunately or unfortunately, that bill failed. I also saw in North Carolina, some of you may have seen this as well, it was brought to my attention that there was a bill that would have excluded any businesses without several years of medical marijuana experience from applying for a medical marijuana license. So essentially excluding everyone who lives in North Carolina because they don't have legal medical marijuana experience. That was kind of a shock to me. So definitely look out for these tactics and strategies, because you can't get to equity until you have a level, fair playing field. You can't have a level, fair playing field if you're giving certain groups special advantages and grandfathering, or things that they might be called, you know, all different kinds of names for that same concept. And in Massachusetts, I say it's the biggest lesson because we actually had a limit. We have a limit on how many business licenses one person or business can control, 3 of each type. And so when companies started reaching that limit quickly because they had these advantages, we invested in making sure that there weren't loopholes, that you couldn't go past those limits. And that was what saved us, because allowing companies to take advantage of the equity programs and the various benefits, it took a long time. And again, it's going to be different in every state, what that ends up looking like. So in the meantime, you need to make sure that other companies are not going to dominate the business, because you'll never be able to really, you know, catch up to that easily. You have to know going in that you want to prevent that you want to have a chance for small businesses and for minority-owned companies and any other historically excluded groups that you want to make sure are in the industry. Last 2 things I want to close with here. One is the state-run model. I actually mentioned that again already, but I just want to hit on it again. I hope you'll consider being the first state potentially to look at a state-run model, or at least weigh the advantages and disadvantages, especially because we don't have a state yet that has a successful, equitable, for-profit model. Maybe we will soon. I think New York is a exciting one to look at, but we don't have that yet. And then also federal legalization is coming and small businesses are going to need protection. The Attorney General in Colorado wrote a letter last year asking for policies to protect small and local businesses from a national corporate takeover. And it was the most forward-looking, I think, not reactive, but forward-looking and proactive letter that I've seen from an attorney general. So definitely pay attention to that happening. And thanks again for the opportunity to share these lessons. I'll put the link to the papers in the chat.
Thank you so much for that, Shalene. Our final speakers are Keisha Mallette from the North Carolina Justice Center, where she's a staff attorney, and Brent Bailey, who is the Buncombe County Reentry Council Coordinator. Keisha and Brent, I'll turn it over to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for having us. I'm sharing my screen now. Hopefully you can see the PowerPoint. We're just going to be talking a little bit about cannabis and some of the criminal justice implications, some of the information around what current expunction laws allow in North Carolina, and just some different ways that we can consider how we might move forward. So as you've already heard reference from panelists and from Jasmine that the drug policies that we have in place today are a remnant of the war on drugs. In many cases, we find that drug policies in place are a major contributor to mass incarceration, that there are incredibly harsh consequences for Black and Brown folks in particular. For example, a Black person is 3.64 times more likely to be arrested for possession than a white person. And there have been roughly 6,000 deportations each year over these issues. Also, we see, as was referenced before, reported uses are very similar, although we see very high differences in arrests and convictions. Just want to pause briefly for Britt to share a little bit about what this might look like in day-to-day.
Yes, so in working with people returning back to the community from incarceration, a lot of times you can see where this journey through the criminal justice system began. And of course, no one's shocked by this, but disproportionately, young Black men, a lot of their first offense, first conviction had to deal with marijuana possession. And so that, as it says at the top, major contributor to mass incarceration. Oftentimes this was like, people call marijuana a gateway drug. It was definitely a gateway into this criminal justice system. And then you'll see years later how someone just got in and never was able to escape or get out. So I just wanted to highlight that as it relates to the racial disparity.
Thank you. And so some pieces that we can think about with these lasting impacts, which Brent will be able to expound on even more, are just the variety of collateral consequences that exist, all the way from someone being able to have access to housing and employment, to access to public benefits, and even being subject in North Carolina to a drug tax for either charges or convictions that are drug related. So handing it over to Brent again, just to expound a little bit more on what the SNAP felony ban looks like in our state.
And I'm not sure who all the attendees are. And many of them may know this, so I apologize if it's kind of redundant. But of course, if you have a felony drug conviction, if it's H or I, which pretty much deals with small amount possession, you have to wait 6 months before you can receive food stamps. And if you have a class G or higher, which typically is going to deal with some form of distribution, you have a lifetime ban in North Carolina. Now, mind you, you'll still be taxed at the same rate as every other citizen. And we know that it's tax dollars that fund these programs. So in some respects, you have participation as far as providing for this program, but then no participation if you ever need it. And I speak from personal experience because I myself currently am under a lifetime ban. So North Carolina does not have to continue this. Something they opted into SNAP is a federal program, but then they allow the states to determine how it's going to be distributed. And so we've been trying to get this overturned for some years now. So again, I don't know who the attendees are, but if you have any type of influence or power as it relates to getting that lifted in North Carolina, it would be greatly appreciated, because at the end of the day, it's for people to eat, a basic need. And while we determine individuals with drug convictions aren't worthy of that, I'm not sure.
Thank you, Brent, for that. And also just to emphasize that we're not seeing any clear correlation being made between someone having a drug conviction and that person somehow either being able to have access to food, or that there being some perverse incentive in place for someone having access to SNAP benefits. So just to hone in on what Brent said again, everyone should be able to have access to food, and particularly in terms of considering preventing recidivism and other concerns, then removing this ban would be a path forward.
And just quickly, Keisha, on the collateral consequence aspect, I would say if we're looking at moving forward, whether that's decriminalized, legalized, where these things that happened in the past won't continue to happen for people, I think retroactively we have to go back to shift some of that so folk don't continue with those collateral consequences from a criminal conviction. And I mean, it affects you in every area, from housing, from rental applications, from the SNAP felony ban, as you see, from employment opportunities. And so it's just a thing that if we're going to move forward, which is great, I don't think we should forget about the folk who've already suffered under these policies.
Absolutely, thank you. Excuse me. So some ways that we can go beyond legalization and decriminalization, kind of thinking about what Brent said and adding on to that, what are some ways that we can think about process of legalization of marijuana or cannabis that does not continue to impose harms on folks who have already been impacted. There are ways to offer expunction and resentencing opportunities for individuals with past convictions. I'll share a little bit more about what the current expunction laws allow in North Carolina, but certainly just emphasizing what Brent said before, that we do not want to see people to continue to be dealing with sentences for acts that are now legal. Or will be legal in the future. Also want to eliminate these different remnants of the war on drugs. And so kind of that broad list that Brent provided earlier, including the drug tax and the SNAP felony ban. And then we also want to ensure more effective regulations for law enforcement as paths to legalization, our medical marijuana markets are rolled out. So in North Carolina, we do have expunctions, two major expunction laws that allow for expunctions that would include individuals who may have drug-related or marijuana-related convictions. Under the North Carolina Second Chance Act, someone who has multiple nonviolent misdemeanor convictions may be eligible for an expunction after 5 years if there's one, or 7 years if there are multiple. And then most recently, the Expand Expunction Eligibility Act, which allows for someone with up to 3 nonviolent felony convictions to be eligible for an expunction after 10 years if there's one conviction, and after 20 years if there are 2 to 3 convictions. There are certainly efforts being made to try to expand access to those laws, but essentially as these laws allow both for individual petitions to be filed to get expunctions, and there is a pathway being created here as well to automation that is in process. So generally, most drug convictions are considered nonviolent. So if someone does have a marijuana-related conviction, it is likely eligible with some exceptions. And I provide a list of the exceptions here and won't read all of them, but just, for example, the Class A to G felonies and A1 misdemeanors. So Shalene earlier referenced the legislation that was being considered in North Carolina that was proposed in the 2021-2022 session, Senate Bill 711, titled the North Carolina Compassionate Care Act. Upon looking at that legislation that had been proposed, we did recognize that this would allow some access to medical marijuana for individuals with major health conditions. As you already heard from our earlier panelists, there are certainly limitations to who might be able to access this market if available. But it also created a blanket ban on individuals with a history of certain criminal convictions, and also criminalized marijuana by creating new offenses for marijuana possession. And so we do want to make sure that there is really careful consideration around what it means to either have a new market for medical marijuana and or, as was described before, adult use that does not further criminalize individuals or bar individuals who have been criminalized, particularly with prior drug-related convictions. So a few recommendations that we, are suggesting for best practice around this are to follow the model of raise the age parity expunctions under the Second Chance Act, which allows for automated expunction. And so this would mean that an individual who may have a record, a criminal conviction that is related to marijuana possession, for example, or marijuana that otherwise is expungible, that there's an automated process for that expungement to happen. Or to have a robust petition-based system that would allow for access to expunctions that doesn't necessarily require someone to have to try to find an attorney. And currently there are ways that people can file these pro se without an attorney, but that doesn't necessarily make it easy or accessible for individuals to do so. Do not allow for more criminalization. So do not create do not add more ways that people can be criminalized once the new market is in place. And then also do not forget those who have been a part of the legacy market. So whether that be from individuals having an opportunity to be part of the industry, to be employed in the industry, and or to just not be barred from access to the industry or be continue to be criminalized once there is a new industry in place. And I just wanted to pause in case Brent has anything else to add, and I'll share this source list.
I was reading in the Q&A, it's some interesting stuff in there. I would say, like, because it's a lot of talk about criminal justice reform, right? And most people are saying, yeah, we need some reform. And then, you know, there's those that are all the way on the side of, no, we need to dismantle. And so I'll say that maybe the whole system can't be dismantled, but I think this is one part that can be. I think we can get the criminalization of marijuana completely out the system. So that's at least one aspect of it that's been dismantled. Because let's be honest, it's difficult to reform something that is historically proven to exercise extreme disparity. So if there's an opportunity to dismantle, I think we should. And just wanted to kind of add that. In that Q&A, somebody said they had somebody with a weed conviction from 30 years ago, and they're being told they have to terminate that person. So I want to see how that answer goes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keisha and Brent. We are going to get to your questions in the Q&A. Continue to put them in. We'll get to as many as we can. I do have a few starting questions for our panelists. If you can come back on video so I can see your lovely faces, that would be great. I do want to start with this question of the state-run system that Shalene raised, because we do have that system for alcohol here in North Carolina, and there's a lot of interest in whether or not it can be replicated for cannabis. Obviously, a system like that funnels revenue to the state. What provisions need to be in place to make sure that this revenue is used to address past harm of cannabis policy? That could be for any of our speakers.
I'll start, Jasmine. First, every state that creates as Shalene said, all of the states right now have private run industry. We don't have that state model in operation right now. All of those states tax cannabis, and the legislature determines where that revenue is directed. And so typically that revenue is directed in part to fund the regulatory operations of the state. And other funding is allocated to a variety of purposes. The most frequent ones are education, police retraining, mental health and addiction services, in some cases, issues around infrastructure and transportation, money toward hospitals for non-mental health and addiction services, essentially making the effort to identify what people in the community and people in the legislature believe are the potential harms of legalization, and then funnel tax revenue towards those areas that people are concerned about. In the same way that that is done with a private model, that revenue can be allocated and earmarked in an identical way through a public run model.
Thank you, John. Does anyone else want to speak to this question? Okay, so can you explain how best to ensure that small businesses and Black-owned businesses are benefited when you're setting up a regulatory scheme or a scale scheme for cannabis? Does horizontal versus vertical integration of the industry solve that problem entirely, or are there other guardrails that states need to be thinking about?
I'm going to plug my paper again, just because that's what the whole thing is on. But on the horizontal and vertical integration question, I think that generally just allowing that, or in some cases requiring it, like a lot of the earlier programs required vertical integrations for what they thought was safety reasons. I think that's actually pretty bad for equity. It's really, really hard for small and often minority-owned businesses to raise that kind of capital. We didn't even have one minority-owned business in our medical program here, because I think associated with the fact that vertical integration was required. But what you could do is the opposite. You could actually only allow vertical integration potentially for certain populations. So here in Massachusetts, if you're a micro business and you're also social equity, so keep in mind those are two different things. But if you're both of them, you can actually wholesale cannabis and then deliver it straight to consumers, like skip the whole retail step. And it's a very special thing that only those groups have, that certain type of vertical integration. So I think being creative like that is wise.
Thank you. I want to go back to this question that Keisha raised around additional criminalization as we are legalizing. Are there provisions that we can put in place to really minimize that possibility of additional criminalization as we go through this process?
Well, what I would say, Jasmine, is I think there is this false belief out there that legalization solves the problem. What we know is that the same forces that create racial disparities in arrest rates pre-legalization remain in place during and after legalization. And that bears out in the data. There's a great report from a couple of years ago from the ACLU that looks at racial disparities in arrest rates. It's an update from their report in 2013, but unlike their report in 2013, they had a lot of data available from states that have already legalized and data over time within each of those states. And what they show is that while the racial disparity in arrest rates in legal states comes down, and the number of arrests in legal states plummets, disparities still exist in the remaining criminalization around cannabis. So instead of 2.8 times more likely to be arrested a Black person than a white person, I think the number is 2.2 times more likely. And so what that tells you is that legalization is not the end of the pursuit of justice around racial inequities in drug policy. It is the beginning of that process. And so police retraining, and better community relations, working closely with law enforcement to identify the types of behaviors and ideologies and activities and tactics that are used within communities that facilitate those types of disparities. Those need to be addressed because legalization is not the entirety of the answer. It's just one small part.
Thank you for that, John. If other speakers want to.
If I could add just a practical tip I've noticed being involved in legalization in several states is that you have to ask for those kinds of reforms at the beginning and make sure that they're included, and make sure they're included with timelines and funding, because we often see states where they say, okay, we'll just legalize it now and do the sales, and then down the line, we'll address those issues, and then, of course, they never do.
Thank you, Shalene. Keisha, I know the Justice Center has been very active with the Second Chance Alliance and working with expunction issues. And at the same time, those of us who are working in the space recognize how complicated and complex the issue of expunctions is and how people get access to expunctions. What additional resources do we need to expunge past low-level convictions for cannabis possession? I'm asking you, Keisha, because I know that you all are active in the space, but certainly any of our speakers can speak to it as well.
Well, just to highlight, as I mentioned before, that currently many of the expunctions that someone might pursue, even though someone may be eligible for an expunction in most drug-related convictions that are deemed nonviolent per our state statute, there still are limitations based on individuals needing to still, in most cases, file their own petitions. And so what that creates much of an access issue when someone doesn't know how to maneuver that process and or doesn't have access to an attorney who can assist them. And so again, it's this being able to knowing that something like once there are new laws in place, making sure that there's some process for automation that would ensure that any related convictions that remain in the state are able to be expunged as a part of that process. And just also, I guess, just going back to thinking about the prior question in terms of what could be considered with the potential laws that would go forward to make sure at a minimum there are no additional criminalization provisions included in future legislation as just a starting point. So that's maybe partial answer to your question, but just want to emphasize that.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. We are going to go to the Q&A now. Greg, do we have some?
We do. We have a bunch of questions. I'll start first with a question from Representative John Autry. Is medical cannabis considered medicine? How would that affect the ability to levy a tax?
So Greg, I had noted just like 5 seconds ago in answer to that question, most states tax medical cannabis. A few states, after they've legalized for medical cannabis and levied a tax, have decided to reduce the taxes or in a couple of cases, eliminate the taxes, desiring to treat medical cannabis in the same way that traditional pharmaceuticals are treated, as an untaxed product. There are some pros and cons to both of those approaches. I think from an equity and fairness approach that Shalene and I talked about in our opening remarks, being able to reduce the cost of this product to individual patients is critical in terms of helping guarantee their access to those products. At the same time, medical cannabis is an expensive regulatory effort. And if the state is unwilling to appropriate separately for that office to operate, the revenue that is collected from medical cannabis can help fund the operations of that agency or department and the workers within it. Personally, I think that lowering the cost of medical cannabis, particularly through taxation as much as possible, is a helpful thing for issues of access. But it is I think, an open question for a legislature to take on in order to figure out where they come down on it and where they best see state revenue allocated.
Thank you, John. Oh, Shalene, did you want to?
Yeah, just real quick. So Massachusetts is one of the states where patients are not taxed whatsoever. And they also qualify based on any condition. It's up to them and their doctor. And there was some concern that that might reduce the taxes that came in for adult use. But that, I would not say that's been the case. We just hit $2 billion in adult sales and 20% of that is taxed. So I don't think that having fair, accessible patient rules has really harmed that in any way.
Greg?
Next question is from Representative Greg Meyer. Legislators will have to address the question of what aspects of medical marijuana do need criminal consequences and what those consequences should be. What guidance can you give us on how to set those standards in a way that does not perpetuate the harmful, wasteful war on drugs?
Sounds like our speakers might not think it's necessary to have criminal consequences. I don't want to speak for them.
I can take that.
Okay.
This is, it's a personal opinion, of course, but the approach that I took was that if there is harm being done by the business, to people, and usually it is businesses. It can also be illicit businesses. But the one place where I think criminal consequences are necessary is if, for example, with the vaping illnesses that were happening a couple of years ago because the products were using ingredients that were causing people to have serious lung issues and sometimes die. I think criminal consequences would be appropriate there personally.
And I would add quickly, I agree with what Shalene said. Also, when you look at, and I'm sure Shalene will agree on at least the first part, like sales to minors too. If that's happening within industry or whether that's happening in the illicit market, that's clearly a place where the vast majority of Americans, the vast majority of North Carolina residents would see a need for that type of intervention. The other, I see, trafficking is something that is oftentimes thrown into a very broad category that can catch people who are actually moving relatively small amounts of product. But if we're talking about massive movement of product in the illicit market or massive movement of illicit product within the legal market, I think there's a place for there to consider maintaining criminalization. It both affects the legal market and its ability to operate, and it ends up running unregulated product through a system that's intended to be regulated.
Okay, Greg, what do you have next?
Next question is from Michael. Is there any tax reinvestment model where the tax money goes to treatment? If not, why?
I would recommend looking at the Citizens Initiative in Ohio. They have probably the most robust that I've seen in terms of sending marijuana tax revenue to mental health and addiction services, and then a report that would show how it was used every year.
Another interesting model that doesn't exactly line up with this question, but is an interesting one, is what's being done in Pennsylvania's medical system, where dispensaries can partner with research universities throughout the state. The acronym is ACRC, and what that actually stands for, I can't remember right now, but it's a research consortium that actually uses the product that is on the shelves in dispensaries and the cannabis that's being produced by grower processors in the state to be used in medical research and understanding what the impacts are on patients within the state. And I think that's a really valuable resource to better understand this product that, as we all know, the federal government's rules have vastly reduced the ability of scientists and other medical researchers in the United States from doing the necessary research on the product for decades.
Greg, what do we have next?
Touched a little bit on youth consumption. One of the questions is, how do you avoid adolescent use under age 21 to protect brain development?
I'll start. I think that there's a lot of really great lessons from big tobacco to learn here, and we don't have to learn them the hard way. So most states prohibit advertising that is attractive to children, and they have very strict rules as far as who can be on the property of a marijuana business and how you can get in, how you can make a purchase, and how often the ID needs to be checked. And I think that is related to why we haven't seen youth consumption go up in places where marijuana is legal.
And when you look at the data out of the states that have had sustained systems like Washington and Colorado for going on a decade now, what you find is that the ID check compliance within dispensaries is dramatically higher than it is for tobacco sellers and for alcohol sellers. And I think that's a really encouraging figure. It's not 100%, but it's well over 90% in most jurisdictions. And no system is going to be perfect. But again, what Shalene said in terms of regulating the advertising around this and learning from the models that we've seen in the past from big alcohol and big tobacco. One of the most frustrating things for me, I'm sure it's a frustrating thing for Shalene as well, is when you have ballot initiatives or legislation before a legislature that is labeled, regulate cannabis like alcohol. No, what you should do is regulate cannabis better than alcohol. It's true if you use a state-run model for selling cannabis. Using the alcohol model loosely might be good, but replicating it is bad because we know that alcohol and tobacco contribute to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of deaths in the United States every year. And the last thing that you want to do is create a cannabis regulatory system that mirrors what is a largely failed regulatory system around alcohol and tobacco in this country.
Thanks, John. Greg, what's next?
Next question from the audience. What is the latest on legislation on the federal level to remove cannabis from Schedule I classification?
So I'm very bearish about this. We don't have 50 votes in the United States Senate for legalization right now, or at least a single bill that even 50 senators can agree on to move forward for full-scale legalization. You would need 60 votes to do that in the U.S. Senate, and so full-scale federal legalization is not going to happen in the current Congress that gavels out in January. There is a massive chance that the next Congress will be controlled by Republicans, at least on the House side, and probably on the Senate side too. House Republican and Senate Republican leadership have made it clear that they do not support legalization. And if that's the case, you'll have another 2-year period at least in which legalization does not pass the United States Congress. There are administrative routes by which the executive branch could do this, but I think it's fairly clear that President Biden is not supportive of full-scale legalization. And in fact, the president has not even delivered on the small promises that he made with regard to cannabis reform when he was a candidate for office in 2020. And I don't expect him, having not fulfilled even those small promises, to transform into a supporter of legalization and to instruct his administration to legalize through the administrative route.
Thank you, John. We have just about 1 minute left, so I actually just want to spend this time for any closing comments from any of our panelists that you're burning to get out. Sounds like nothing is burning. Okay. All righty. Well, I want to thank our panelists for being with us today, and thank all of our audience participants. And if you know folks that might be interested in seeing this panel, it is available on our YouTube page to watch afterwards. So everyone have a great rest of the day and a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.